Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are on the planet. And welcome to this plenary roundtable on human rights in U.S. foreign policy. My name is Daniel Whalen. I teach international relations and political theory at Hendrix College in Arkansas. And I'm one of the conference co-chairs, and I will be moderating this panel. In the most recent edition in 2020 of International Human Rights, which I co-author with Jack Donnelly, our chapter on US foreign policy and human rights devotes 3 pages covering the Carter through Obama administrations. In contrast, we devoted nearly 6 pages to the Trump administration, then only 3 years in, along 4 different dimensions. The length reflecting how dramatically we felt the Trump administration had departed from long-standing and largely bipartisan consensus on core American human rights principles and policies. In light of the past 5 years, and now with a new administration at the helm, this is a timely topic indeed. A few housekeeping items before I introduce our distinguished panelists. First, the session is open to the public beyond those who were officially registered for the conference. It will be recorded and posted later by our host, the School of Advanced Study of the University of London. I'd like to thank the staff and volunteers at SAS for helping to organize this virtual event. Each panelist will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, and which will leave plenty of time for Q&A and discussion at the end of the session. If you'd like to pose a question, which you could do at any time, please use the Q&A button in the Zoom platform. And I will moderate those questions through to the panelists after the presentations are over. The panelists will present in the order posted in the program. I'll introduce each one before their respective presentations. As you know, U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, Kara McDonald, was supposed to have delivered our first remarks, but unfortunately she's not able to join us due to illness. Thankfully, however, the Bureau arranged to have Ms. Lynn Sicade join us in Das McDonald's place. Ms. Sicade is Office Director of the Bureau for Democracy, Labor, Human Rights, Office of Multilateral and Global Affairs. The office handles an array of human rights and democracy policy issues with respect to the UN, internet freedom and technology, business and human rights, marginalized populations, civil society, and good governance. Ms. Sicade began her career in the State Department in 1990. She has served in El Salvador, the United Kingdom, the Western Hemisphere of Affairs Bureau, and the East Asia and Pacific Bureau. She joined the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor in 2001. An expert on human rights in the UN, Ms. Sicade has represented the US at the UN, where she negotiated and delivered positions on behalf of the United States. She has authored several UN resolutions, most notably the resolution that created the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Association and Peaceful Assembly. She has received numerous superior and meritorious honor awards. Prior to joining DRL, Ms. Sicade served as the Special Assistant to the US Representative to the Guarantors of the Rio Protocol. In this capacity, she worked with the team that set the foundation for peace between Ecuador and Peru. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Sicade.
Thank you, Dr. Whalen, fellow panelists and guests. Thank you for this opportunity and for your warm welcome. It's a pleasure to contribute to the Human Rights Consortium's conference and an honor to participate with such a distinguished slate of panelists. I hope this roundtable sets the stage for a meaningful conversation on the range of issues as they relate to human rights. But today I want to talk about the Biden-Harris administration's prioritization of human rights in US foreign policy, how that sits in our domestic framework, how that sits in the frame of our domestic agenda, and what it means in the practice of diplomacy. President Biden has vowed to put human rights at the heart of US foreign policy, to lead not by the example of our power, but by the power of our example. I'm often asked what that means in practice, and I am a large part of the governmental team whose job it is to translate those words into action. So I'll describe a little bit how the US Department of State upholds and uplifts this renewal of democracy at home and abroad, as it's vital to facing today's most pressing global challenges. As many of you are well aware, and I'm sure this conference will discuss at greater length, we're seeing a global decline in freedom due to government's consolidation and/or abuse of power and restriction of individual liberties. Autocratic rule in places like Belarus and Burma have obstructed and/or overturned elections that express the will of the people, undermined the independence of or explicitly used legislatures and judiciaries to consolidate power, and violated human rights and fundamental freedoms of their populations. Corrupt actors restrict access to information, misuse public funding, and erode faith that democratic governments can bring a better future. 3 pillars of democracy: the rights of freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and association are under attack. President Biden has charged the US Department of State with confronting and pushing back on these threats to democracy and human rights. So, what does this look like in practice? Before I speak about how we operationalize this in our diplomacy, I want to address how we're examining these questions at home and harmonizing our diplomacy with our domestic agenda. Restoring our democracy in the United States is a critical part of President Biden's foreign policy vision. We can't be credible advocates for democracy and human rights abroad if we don't live up to those same principles at home. As Secretary Blinken has said, we're taking steps to address the inequities and injustices in our own democracy. We do so openly and transparently for people around the world to see, even when it's ugly, even when it's painful. Authoritarian regimes do point to our shortcomings, including institutionalized racism and the violence that goes with it. On this, we do not claim the moral high ground, but we do, in the words of our Constitution, resolve to form a more perfect union. So we're matching our diplomatic agenda with our domestic one. Our return, for example, to the UN Human Rights Council is an opportunity to combat systemic racism as a part of the global effort to defend human rights. The Biden-Harris administration has begun efforts to root out inequality and expand opportunities for underserved communities. On its first day in office, the president issued Executive Order 13985. This executive order advances racial equity across our government. The effort relates directly to our engagement with other countries in the wake of George Floyd's murder. His murder revived a movement for racial justice and equity worldwide. The effort, while focused on us, is not ours alone. When people facing repression in other countries see that Americans can freely express themselves, protest peaceably, criticize political leaders without retribution, and possibly see the results of their protests become an advancement for equality and human rights, it gives strength to those fellow global citizens striving for their own model of democracy. So our foreign policy and our domestic call are intertwined and they are deeply connected. Now let me go into some detail on how we translate this holistic agenda and leverage a range of diplomatic, multilateral, bilateral, and trade tools in our push for an impactful foreign policy. In our diplomacy, we partner with other governments to craft multilateral approaches and actions to confront this surge of authoritarianism. Under the Biden-Harris administration, we are rejuvenating our multilateral partnerships and building bridges with allies around the world to challenge the leading exporters of authoritarianism and to tackle global issues. We've rejoined the Paris Agreement, we've re-engaged with the World Health Organization and the UN Human Rights Council. We stand alongside countries across the globe to deter and defend against actions by the People's Republic of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and others who seek to undermine universal rights and values. We raise bilaterally any backsliding as it occurs. This is not always comfortable, it's not always easy, it's not always public, and we do so humbly and with resolve. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights begins with the word universal, because there are certain rights to which every person is entitled. With a belief in human rights for all persons, we work to protect members of marginalized and underrepresented populations, including LGBTQI+ persons, persons with disabilities, members of ethnic, racial, and religious minorities, members of indigenous populations, and women and girls. We work from the grassroots to the highest levels of governments in our push for a more free and just global society. We do this while upholding the truth enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that all individuals are born equal in dignity and in rights. Through assistance programs and close diplomatic outreach, we engage and support civil society to try to eliminate oppression, corruption, and violence. We strengthen institutions that combat authoritarianism, such as independent judiciaries, watchdog organizations, and an independent media. When targeted repression occurs, we defend human rights activists, journalists, and their organizations with critical support to such needs as physical security, psychosocial assistance, and legal defense. We believe that safeguarding marginalized persons and promoting inclusion are key factors in ensuring that societies can be democratic and resilient. Our Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor plays a lead role in these efforts with an annual allocation of about $370 million toward programs that address human rights abuses globally. For example, through capacity building partnerships such as the Global Equality Fund, we provide emergency assistance to human rights defenders and initiatives in support of LGBTQI+ persons. Additionally, our rapid response mechanism provides real-time support to embattled activists and victims of religiously motivated violence or gender-based violence. Working closely with civil society partners, we develop custom indicators to measure the scope, the reach, and the impact of these projects, striving for meaningful, immediate, and long-term outcomes. With this, I underscore the importance of civil society and the power of social movements, individual human rights, and democracy defenders around the world. We seek to amplify the voices of brave activists who are pressing governments to meet commitments to their own people and to abide by their obligations under international law. Civil society organizations and citizens seeking democratic reform can help convey public concerns to authorities, support the delivery of essential services, press governments to counter disinformation, and advocate for marginalized and vulnerable populations. Drawing on public diplomacy as a tool, we also act as a convener and a vocal advocate for human rights defenders. The department hosts roundtables, people-to-people exchanges, outreach activities to hear directly from and share the stories of individuals fighting for justice and equality around the world. We also leverage opportunities to spotlight our priorities on various international days. Just this past Saturday, it was UN World Day Against Child Labor, and we spearheaded a global campaign to spread awareness on this issue. Further, the US government uses tools such as visa restrictions, financial sanctions, assistance restrictions, and trade incentives to counter democratic backsliding and to promote accountability for abuses. Sorry about that. I'm often asked whether we feel these tools are effective. As with so much, it depends on how, to what purpose, and with what skill they are wielded. In some cases, the threat of a sanction or a trade incentive may yield leverage. And others, a sanction may target financial pipelines of repression. And in still others, travel restrictions on the family members of a rights abuser may communicate that such behavior will not go without consequence. Coordination with allies is at a premium in this area as it improves impact and efficacy of such tools. Relatedly, we rally our allies to counter threats aimed at our democracies, including malicious cyber activities, disinformation, corruption, and economic coercion. We seek to strengthen the rules-based international order while addressing grievances, especially unfair trading practices that have provoked backlash against the open international economic order. The department promotes fair and reciprocal trade by working to ensure that our trade agreements incorporate strong labor obligations while making certain that our trading partners and their businesses are protect fundamental labor standards and respect human rights. The COVID-19 pandemic has contributed to greater democratic backsliding, requiring all of us to assess all diplomatic tools at our disposal to reverse the trend. Under the guise of the global emergency, authoritarian governments have violated the rights of their people, seriously restricting or curtailing the exercise of their civil liberties. For over a year and a half, we've seen governments use the pandemic to excuse, limit to access information, censor the media, punish the exercise of freedom of expression, including subjecting individuals and organizations to criminal penalties for independent reporting on the pandemic and government's responses to it. The State Department and USAID have been in the forefront of the US government's response to the pandemic's negative impact on the open exchange of information, on civic participation, and free and fair elections. We are documenting COVID-19 restrictions and empowering local civil society partners so that they can press their governments for transparency and accountability. The US will continue engaging in multi-stakeholder fora, such as the G7, the Freedom Online Coalition, the Community of Democracies, the Global Action on Disability Network, the Open Government Partnership, the Media Freedom Coalition, the UN, of course, and many other fora to support joint actions that call on governments to democratically manage the COVID-19 crisis. I know that another session of this conference will take a deep dive on human rights in the pandemic and will shed more light on this particular topic. Lastly, and as a call for renewal, President Biden pledged that the US will host a summit for democracy to bolster democracy worldwide by pushing back against authoritarianism, to fight corruption, and to promote respect for human rights both at home and abroad. The summit aims to honestly confront and challenge democratic backsliding and forge a common agenda to fortify democratic institutions. Plans for the summit are in progress, and participating governments will be expected to deliver on both domestic and international commitments. We will engage countries from all regions, as well as the private sector and civil society sector. I want to thank you again for allowing me this opportunity to detail foreign policy with democracy and human rights at its heart. I look forward to learning from the distinguished panel and all of you thought leaders and scholars who've devoted your lives to defending and advancing human rights. Thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you so much for your comments. We really appreciate it. Our next speaker is David Forsythe, Professor Emeritus at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where he held the Charles J. Mock Distinguished Chair in Political Science and was named a university professor, the highest distinction awarded by that institution. He was among the early pioneers in the study of international human rights by social scientists in the English-speaking world, producing an undergraduate textbook on the subject in 1983. In 2009, he edited the 5-volume Encyclopedia of Human Rights, which was named the best reference publication for that year by the American Library Association. At about that same time, he was named a Fulbright Distinguished Research Scholar for Denmark. In addition to human rights, he has manifested a long interest in humanitarian affairs and the diplomacy of the International Red Cross, with 2 books and several articles focused on the International Committee of the Red Cross. Having published a book on the politics of international human rights earlier this year, he is now at work on a 3rd book on the contemporary ICRC. Professor Forsythe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction. And I thank the people responsible for this meeting. And I'm very grateful to have been invited to participate in all this. And I certainly welcome the comments of our previous speaker. And that's her remarks are a very welcome change, I think, from the previous administration. What I want to do is something a little bit different. Rather than talk about the details of US foreign policy on human rights or any other state and human rights, I want to reflect a little bit on the big picture and the interplay of national agency, human agency, and the larger structural factors. And all of this adds up to a bit of what I would call historical realism or caution. Some people would say pessimism, but I'm not trying to be pessimistic, but I am trying to be realistic about what all the bits and pieces might add up to. I'm not young. I've been following these subjects for decades. And as I look back over the past 40 or 50 years, and I look at international relations today, what strikes me is that despite all of the well-intentioned initiatives from certain US administrations and others, that what we see is a lack of kind of fundamental or structural change for the better on human rights. And in particular, we lack arrangements, institutions, organizations that can be authoritative and effective. I think maybe similar to someone like John Mearsheimer or Stephen Walt, that structural realism explains a lot about human rights and world affairs. I think what we see, despite various statements, is that most states prioritize security and economics. And this is perfectly reasonable in an anarchistic world without global government, and without effective global governance. We see day in and day out a lot of the old problems, and they haven't changed. And I was glad that our previous speaker started out by noting something that's been documented by Freedom House and other NGOs, and that is a persistent decline in democracy and freedom and personal rights over the past more or less 15 years. So we still see a great deal of illiberalism. We see a lot of chauvinistic nationalism. We see a lot of drive for power. Given the limited time, I will skip my extended analysis of President Putin. Or I noticed that Biden just met with Erdogan of Turkey. There's another national leader that we can go into some depth on. But we still see that all of the documents, all of the treaties, all of the norms, all of the diplomacy have not had persistent, profound effect on a tremendous number of national leaders. And okay, I mentioned Putin, I mentioned Erdogan, we could talk about Orban, we could talk about Modi, we could talk about Bolsonaro, and on and on and on. We talk about the junta in Myanmar. We could talk about what's going on in Tigray and Ethiopia and the response of the international community. So to sum up, I still see a great effect of structural realism, where states are compelled to prioritize security and economics. And then these impulses are cross-cut by tribal loyalties and personal drives for power. If there is to be a change in authoritative international arrangements, I think this will probably come about not because of some epiphany about human rights, but because of global warming, forcing certain authoritative international arrangements on the global community. And I think this is not altogether good news for human rights. Just as COVID-19 impelled restrictions on personal freedom for the sake of public health, I believe extreme climate change will also lead to quite serious, but in some cases necessary, restrictions on personal freedoms for physical security, for continuation of life as we know it. So I'm not terribly optimistic about the workings of climate change on the future of human rights. Having said all that, and having perhaps presented myself as a Cassandra, I suggest in a book published earlier this year on human rights that individuals and individuals leading states and individuals in the State Department, et cetera, can make a difference, but probably at the margins and within definite limits. It does make a difference whether we have a Biden or a Trump as head of the United States. It does make a difference whether we have a Merkel or an Orban leading countries in Europe. It does make a difference. John Humphrey and René Cassin were very important in the 1940s in helping to produce the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but they could not get Stalin and Truman to accept those values in a binding treaty. Stalin was Stalin, and as we all know, Truman was constrained by the Southern segregationists who controlled important levers in the US Congress. And so at the same time, we note the positive contributions, the positive agency of people like John Humphrey and René Cassin. And we could talk about other individuals in other eras. We could talk about Lauterpacht. We could talk about Lemkin. We could talk about Wallenberg. We could talk about Mandela. But I still think that overall, the advancement of human rights faces very strong limitations. I'm a bit encouraged recently, not so much through formal legal procedures at the UN and other international organizations, but with the workings of social movements. And here I would cite leading example of positive change through the agency of individuals, not so much national leaders and diplomats, but people in the streets, people protesting, people pushing the leaders. And that has to do with what I will call gay rights and gay marriage as a shorthand for sexual minorities or gender minorities or whatever is the preferred terminology. We have seen in recent years striking acceptance of, again, using gay rights as a shorthand, gay rights, striking change in Europe, in North America, in South America. Not so much, of course, in much of the rest of the world, but we do see more tolerance. We do see more acceptance of that kind of personal freedom and personal choice. And I think that's very encouraging, and change can occur. And I think in my mind, it's true that the diplomatic legal processes give us a human rights vocabulary that then these social movements can use to their advantage. And I think that's all very important. I think we can document progress on women's rights and women's equitable treatment, even though we've had setbacks because of the pandemics. I think we can see elements of progress, not so much from formal legal arrangements as from social change in which law follows change. The social movements pressure the official policymakers to make change, and that's important. So I'm not a complete Cassandra. I do see elements of progress on certain issues. I just see a lot of remaining very fundamental barriers and very limits to the change. And I would also say that these structural limitations, the centrality of state sovereignty, for example, in international relations, means that when there is progress, when there are developments, which I think can be called progressive developments, there are still very real limits and perhaps double standards. So we have a renaissance of international criminal justice after the Cold War in the 90s. I think everybody who's with us on this program today knows about the ICTY and the ICTR and the resumption of a focus on international criminal justice because of first events in the Balkans, the Western Balkans, and then in Rwanda, and then we get lots of other things in Sierra Leone and so on and so forth. My point here is that there has been progress. The US had a leadership role in much of this, but there were clear double standards, which particularly the Serbs will remind us that in creating these international criminal courts with authoritative scope, it was limited scope. And one of the reasons that the US and France and others led in creating these courts was because of the assumption that those nations would not wind up in front of the judges. And so you did have double standards, and you still have it with the International Criminal Court, where states do not consent to that authority. And there is a certain progress, and there are certain double standards, and generally with the ICC, with exceptions, the states with military power do not want the court looking over their shoulder about war crimes, for example. And so you don't have very many states with military muscle outside of Western Europe becoming a party to the ICC. So there's progress, but very real limitations, which again is an effort to say, well, yes, we should know progressive change when it occurs, but let's not forget about the structural limitations. Let's not forget about the fundamental problems, which are still with us. I try to tell my students that for each human rights success, some other problem rears its ugly head, waiting for the next generation of human rights supporters to take on that task, whether it be voter suppression in the US, jihadi violence in the Islamic world, right to equal health care in the next pandemic, and so on forever. It's being interested in human rights on a global basis is like being Sisyphus pushing the rock forever uphill. And we need to recognize that. And for the young people getting involved in this field, they need to know what they're getting into. And they need to know how difficult it is to overcome racism and overcome paternalism, which demeans women. And so my remarks are a little bit cautionary. If you look at what's been going on since 1945 and since 1948, and even since the Carter administration, and renewed attention to human rights in the 70s and then the 90s after the Cold War, yes, there is room for human agency. There is room for, you can see at least limited progress, but there are real barriers out there still to overcome for the Biden administration and everybody else involved in this. So a little cautionary note, and I have a little skepticism when I read about renewal of the Atlantic Charter and the signing of a kind of new Atlantic Charter. Well, I have to tell you, the first one didn't work so well. So anyway, there you have it. Thank you very much.
The old mute button, you'd think I'd learn. Thank you, Dave, very much. Our next speaker is Bruce Jentleson, William Preston Few Professor of Public Policy and Professor of Political Science at Duke University. He is also a Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and a longtime co-director and now Senior Advisor for the Bridging the Gap project, promoting greater policy relevance among academics. In 2020, he was the Desmond Ball Visiting Professor at the Australia National University, College of Asia and the Pacific. And in the same year, he received Duke University's Alumni Distinguished Undergraduate Teaching Award. He received the 2018 American Political Science Association International Security Section's Joseph J. Cruzel, I believe that's right, Award for Distinguished Public Service. And in 2015-16, he was the Henry A. Kissinger Chair in Foreign Policy and International Relations at the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. Bruce's most recent book is The Peacemakers, Leadership Lessons from the 20th Century Statesmanship, was published in 2018. His newest book, which will be out in September, I believe, is Economic Sanctions, What Everyone Needs to Know, and that will be published by Oxford University Press. Recent articles include Refocusing U.S. Grand Strategy on Pandemic and Environmental Mass Destruction. That was fall 2020 in the Washington Quarterly, and a 2020/21 series co-authored with James Goldgeiger in Foreign Affairs. The United States Needs a Democracy Summit at Home. A democracy summit is not what the doctor ordered, and the United States is not entitled to lead the world. From 2009 to 11, he was senior advisor to the US State Department Policy Planning Director. Other policy positions include senior foreign policy advisor to Vice President Al Gore in his 2000 presidential campaign, in the Clinton administration State Department as a foreign policy aide to Senators Gore and Dave Durenberger. There's a name from the past. He holds a doctorate from Cornell University and was recipient of the American Political Science Association's Harold D. Laswell Award for his doctoral dissertation. Bruce, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Dan, for the kind introduction and also for the invitation. It's great to be joining my fellow panelists. As Dan said, I have a book coming out from Oxford Press. It's this series they call What Everyone Needs to Know is the subtitle. It seems rather presumptuous, but hey, they put the title on, not me, but it is on economic sanctions, which I've worked on a lot. When I've been in government, I worked on the Iran sanctions in 2009, 2011. Back when I was at state in 1993, worked on the China Tiananmen Square ones, and I've written a lot on it as well. And so I want to focus my remarks on economic sanctions and human rights. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to make a series of points and not develop them very much. Happy to come back to them later, but try to keep my remarks brief. And the thrust really is about the challenge and indeed the dilemma of using sanctions for human rights. So the baseline is that human rights is one of the leading bases for US sanctions. Actually, for the EU, it is the leading basis, similarly for the UK and Canada. There are plenty of recent examples, the Myanmar coup, Navalny, the Belarus Ryanair hijacking and kidnapping of the dissident journalist Roman Protasevich, China and the Uyghurs, and Hong Kong, many others. In a lot of instances, here's another fairly presumptuous term, but this one's not mine, targeted sanctions, so-called smart sanctions, have been used. And the idea is you target governments and key individuals in organizations with the sanctions rather than overall comprehensive sanctions against the population writ large. In 2016, Tom Malinowski, actually current Congressman Malinowski from New Jersey, then Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, for DRL, as they say, really pushed hard on this so-called Global Magnitsky Act, which Congress passed in 2016, is wide authorization for the US to use sanctions on human rights against a variety of countries. In 2020, by the way, the EU established a similar policy called the Global Human Rights Sanctions Regime. And it does go back, Consular Professor Forsythe was saying, you know, back in the Carter years, we used human rights a lot, including against allies like Argentina and Brazil, military regimes. Oftentimes it's been Congress that's pushed them, not just presidents and the like. So this is kind of the baseline of the use of sanctions. Four main arguments for doing so. One is to coerce policy change, impose costs, pay a price on the target regime in an effort to try to compel it to change the policy in question. So-called smart or targeted sanctions often will do things like go after internationally held financial assets, not just of leaders, but of supporters, elites that support them in business or the military, or in state-owned enterprises and the like. And also indirectly, so-called secondary sanctions, by which the United States takes its sanctions and applies them on an extraterritorial basis to companies and banks all around the world. Long-time controversial issue for the United States with our European allies. It's come up in the Iran case. It's coming up in this Nord Stream 2 pipeline case. It goes way, way back. The second objective is even if you can't coerce policy change, you know, make those most responsible pay a price, punish them, impose a price on them, punish those most responsible with some economic consequences. Third objective is a broader deterrence one, that others who might commit human rights violations allegedly will get the message that this could happen to you too, and therefore you will deter them before they start. You know, going back to Thomas Schelling, it's always easier to deter than compel, not always, but in theory. And so there are third parties that these are directed to. And the fourth really rationale and objective is the symbolic action as normative affirmation for the global system and reputational for democracies for the United States. We stand for human rights. as do other democracies. And those whose work is on norms and international affairs pay a lot of attention to this. Those are the main rationales. The question really becomes, how effective are they? They do impose costs directly and indirectly. Some success is inherent in imposing costs. The target state gets burdened. Key individuals get punished. But both policy experience, my own and many others, and the sanctions literature point to a recurring discrepancy between high economic impact and limited policy compliance. And sanctions, in fact, rarely coerce human rights policy change. First of all, the costs are often less than claimed. The actual assets that the international community has access to are not, but often they're not there. For example, with the Myanmar generals right now. Secondly, they can be offset by the regime. Putin, for example, did this in the Ukraine sanctions. Sanctions, those were less human rights specific, but generally, in which he seized property from more liberal elites and gave it to his inner circle. So the costs often are less than claimed. There's sanctions busting. Just to give some examples, ExxonMobil in Russia continued to pursue its oil interests, getting around the sanctions. Various companies have done this with the Uyghurs, with supplies of cotton and other things, companies, everything from Coca-Cola sugar to Nike and shoes. Other countries, alternative trade partners emerge. UN multilateral sanctions have actually been much less on human rights and much more on issues like nonproliferation and terrorism. And so alternative trade partners, be they neighboring countries that have interests or adversaries of the US or others, as the sanctioning. And cryptocurrencies, more recent, there's a really interesting UN report recently that focused on North Korea, but also others, Venezuela, how cryptocurrencies are being used to get around these so-called smart financial sanctions. The other point, I think, is one that is really a misreading of the politics. The notion of targeted sanctions, if you impose costs on elites close to the regime, they're going to be transmission belts to put pressure on the regime. In fact, they're more often than not circuit breakers, because their interests are more consistent with the policies being pursued by the regime, and they're willing to bear the costs, or the costs are offset in ways that I was talking about. And so the basic logic, sort of the chain, the causal chain there of the tactics really misfires. Secondly, it's not just that they're ineffective. One might say, well, they were ineffective, but we did it. They're often counterproductive, making the human rights situation worse. And there's lots of research on this, case-based in general. It's what I term the backfiring and the misfiring problems. The backfiring problem is that governments decide to crack down even more. We've seen this any number of times in China. We've seen it in Russia. There's a lot of literature on this. Serbia was a really good case. Where to quote one study that was done, the 1990 sanctions left opposition groups, quote, isolated, unable to contact international NGOs that have been supporting them, while militia groups used their control of security checkpoints and transportation routes to enrich themselves monetarily while also increasing their political influence. And the misfiring is the humanitarian issue, a fundamental ethical issue here for those who support human rights for ethical reasons, about hitting the civilian population. And there are any number of examples here. In Iraq, the 1990s were the so-called sanctions of mass destruction. In Iran, access to essential medicines and the right to health has been negatively impacted. In Haiti, in the 1990s, there were takeoffs. The word for embargo in Creole is embargo, and the takeoff was embargo, meaning under the heels of the rich and powerful, that the rich and powerful still did reasonably well, while the population didn't. In Venezuela, while principal fault for the humanitarian crisis lies with Maduro and Chavez, 40,000 excess deaths were attributed to the sanctions between 2017 and 2018, to the Trump sanctions. Could go on and on with this, but there are many examples of sanctions misfiring. And again, a lot of really interesting literature. The last example I use is the practice of what's called de-risking that many companies and banks now do, where they get worried about even normal transactions, including helping NGOs that are active in these countries on a humanitarian basis, because the way that the US Treasury and others, and this wasn't just a Trump issue, Biden administration has been using sanctions quite extensively, sort of the same logic in mind, maybe for better causes than we think than Trump, but nevertheless, same logic. And companies feel that they run too much legal risk by having any commercial or financial relations with countries. So, for example, in June 2020, Syria, issue that I worked on a lot in some of my policy work, there was a tweet from a Syrian journalist who said, the economic situation in Syria is at a breaking point. Medicine is very scarce. Hunger is becoming a normality. Poverty is the worst point ever. People even selling their organs to survive. Because international agencies were having trouble helping even, there are other issues, obviously what Saad did in Russia, but this was the impact of sanctions. What of the normative argument? And by the way, South Africa is the iconic case for everybody, but we can talk more about that, but the number of factors that came together in the South Africa case was really quite extraordinary and has not been replicated in any other case. You're left with the notion, again, when I've been in government, how could the United States not impose sanctions on Myanmar after its coup, or against Serbia, or against Russia for Navalny, or China for the genocide against the Uyghurs? To a certain extent, this symbolic action is self-actualizing, that a degree of success is inherent in the very taking. But if you're actually having those negative consequences, from a fundamental normative point of view, it brings us to the classic debates among ethicists between, intentionalists and consequentialists. Well, we really meant to do the right thing. But a consequentialist would say that the consequences on the ground violate that fundamental ethical motivation, no matter how sincere you were in the first place. And so I think the question here from a policy perspective that I found is that the easy use reach for sanctions, when in doubt, reach for sanctions, hey, it's better than drone strikes or military action, often crowds out consideration of other policy options, that there's no master key out there that might actually have fewer negative consequences and may even more positive, and that it would do well for humanitarian reasons, as well as promoting democracy and human rights, to not resort to sanctions, to hold ourselves accountable for not just the high principles for which we use them, but whether or not A, they are effective, and B, in particular, is if they're counterproductive. So anyway, I'll stop there and turn it back to you, Dan, for our next panelist.
Thanks, Bruce. That was really interesting. I'm looking very forward to getting a copy of your book when it comes out. So thank you very much. I'd like to now welcome Andrea Prasow, Deputy Washington Director at Human Rights Watch. Andrea conducts advocacy before the US government on global human rights issues, with a particular focus on national security and foreign policy. Andrea frequently appears on domestic and international radio and television, and has published in a wide variety of print and online media outlets, including Politico, The Hill, and Foreign Policy. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch, Andrea was a defense attorney with the Office of Military Commissions. She served as assistant counsel for Salim Hamdan in the only contested military commission trial to date. Andrea was previously an associate at a New York law firm, where in addition to representing large corporations in complex civil litigation, she served as habeas counsel for 10 Saudi detainees at Guantanamo Bay. Andrea holds an honors BA from the University of Toronto in political science and a JD from Georgetown University Law Center. She is admitted to practice in the state of New York and the District of Columbia. Take it away, Andrea.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Mindful of time, I'm going to try to be as quick as I can because I want to hear comments and questions and hear from my colleagues. But I am going to talk about the Biden administration's report card on human rights and foreign policy. And when I agreed to do this and said that would be my topic, that was before I knew someone from the US government would be here to hear it and refute it. So no, Lynn is a longtime colleague and advocate for human rights. So I'm glad she's here to hear this. I would say that the way I would characterize this administration's approach to foreign policy and human rights is a little bit that it's normal. It's the absence of the negative. I was thinking of this when Daniel talked about his book and how much space was taken up by the Trump administration. And in some senses, I mean, that's wonderful, of course, to not have to constantly be defending against particularly terrible human rights, anti-human rights actions. It also presents some challenges for advocates like myself, because it's very easy to be comfortable in the not horrible. And my job is to push the Biden administration, whichever US administration is present, to be better, to really fully entrench human rights in its foreign policy. And we're certainly very heartened with the administration's rhetoric around it and some actions. But while I don't like giving actual letter grades, I would say there's still a way to go. At the beginning of the administration, right after the election, Human Rights Watch released a list of 12 recommendations, public recommendations. We also provided some very detailed private recommendations to the incoming administration, but I'm just going to read those 12 topics very quickly and then respond, not on all of them, but on a few key ones about what we've seen in the last few months. Also available on our website, if anyone's interested. So the recommendations were to address human rights at home, to project human rights abroad, support rights respecting governments, not rights abusers, demonstrate global climate leadership, take a seat at the international table to push reforms, support human rights defenders, promote and protect sexual and reproductive rights, provide protection for asylum seekers and refugees, ensure that any use of force is lawful and minimizes civilian harm, don't sell or transfer arms to abusive governments, support justice for victims of serious crimes, prioritize human rights diplomacy, and contribute to the global fight against poverty and inequality. As I said, I'm not going to go over each item and give a plus or minus, but I want to highlight a few specific things. So the first is that I would say this administration's approach to foreign policy is characterized by a robust re-engagement with multilateral institutions. Some of these things Lynn outlined in her remarks, and we've really found them to be true, as well as a robust engagement with bilateral and multilateral relationships. I think we can see that on this trip that the president is on now. And consistently, human rights have been part of the public dialogue. So that stands out as different and of course is incredibly important. In terms of specific steps, this administration is seeking election at the Human Rights Council, has removed sanctions on the International Criminal Court Prosecutor's Office, and has used sanctions in a robust way against human rights abusers. So certainly, I look forward to a more detailed conversation about the pros and cons of that. The administration also disavowed the harmful Commission on Unalienable Rights that sought to create a hierarchy of rights, ended support for the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen, with an asterisk. I'll get to the negative part of that in a minute. And we've seen a lot of rhetoric, though not yet a lot of specific instances of linking the foreign and domestic policy issues. This has been significant with respect to race, but again, I think it remains to be seen how that will play out in the foreign policy arena, as well as we've seen a significant increase in diversity in senior positions by this administration, though not necessarily among the foreign policy positions as much, which is a significant problem in US foreign policy writ large. A lot of positive things, which to a certain extent do sort of put us back in the normal place. These are things that people have expected from the US government for some time. Now, on the negative side, I want to highlight just 3 particular issues. And again, hopefully we can have a robust discussion, though I think at this point it will be a very short discussion by the time we get to it. The first and maybe most recent is Israel. Setting aside whatever private engagement took place, the public response by this administration was unbalanced, in that it involved only criticizing Hamas and not Israel, despite concerning indicators of disproportionate civilian harm by Israeli government action. There was no engagement publicly on the underlying issues. Some of you may be aware that in April, Human Rights Watch released a report identifying what we believe to be the legal case for the crime of apartheid, the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution, which we believe are being committed by the Israeli government. That type of analysis points to the significant problematic underlying factors that then produce these periodic episodes of violence. And we haven't seen any robust engagement from the US government on the underlying factors. The settlements, of course, we all know, sort of triggered the latest round of violence. Saudi Arabia. I noted that the US announced an end to its military support for the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. This was a long time coming, something Human Rights Watch advocated for years. But at the same time, the US government did not hold Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, responsible for the brutal killing and dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi. Or more accurately, the US government determined, based on its own assessment, that he was responsible, but chose not to sanction him. Sanction people who reported to him, but not him, for so-called strategic reasons, sending a clear message to the world that human rights and justice were not priority US strategic interests, at least at that moment and with respect to that relationship. I think that that will have long-term reverberating effects far beyond the US-Saudi relationship. And then finally, in the area of counterterrorism, we have no plan for the closure of Guantanamo, although we have seen the administration say that it would like to. Many of you are well aware, we have seen multiple administrations say they would like to close Guantanamo, but absent a robust plan and commitment from the top, it won't happen. When it comes to targeted killings, the use of drones, while we haven't seen any sort of detailed plan about curtailing their use, we have seen the administration, in the context of discussing the Afghanistan withdrawal, talk about retaining some type of counterterrorism force that would continue to have lethal capacity without any explanation of how that would be legal. We have not seen a disavowal of the flawed legal rationale that successive administrations have used for the targeted killing program, and I don't expect to see that anytime soon. And then the final point I'll make is just with respect to civilian harm. We have, as I noted at the outset, one of our public recommendations as well as our private recommendations were about civilian harm. We have not seen yet, it's still early, but we have not seen any sort of plan to do a better job of analyzing civilian harm caused by the US or its partners. The Defense Department just released its latest annual report on civilian harm with numbers that just have nothing to do with reality, completely different from what NGOs and journalists have reported, which has consistently been the case with all of the reporting. Undercounting of civilian harm, failure to use congressionally appropriated funds to provide some sort of redress, some form of redress for victims and survivors, and any kind of comprehensive plan that would prioritize protecting civilians and reducing civilian harm. Instead, we have seen, for example, with Gaza, no public rejection of the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects, which are known to cause significant civilian harm and documented to most recently in Gaza, of course. That is a work in progress. The Defense Department has been working on that for some time under successive administrations. But again, just to summarize, the issues that I've identified are the type that one might have expected the administration to lead with. Recognizing when the Biden administration took office, COVID was and remains a significant priority, as well as the economic situation in the US. In order to fully prioritize and integrate human rights into foreign policy, a number of the issues which I flagged, not only are they failures, but I think they will set this administration back in terms of really being robust and forward-leaning when it comes to its commitment to human rights and foreign policy. I'll stop there and look forward to my colleagues' comments and those of the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Our last speaker is Lisa Vinjamuri, who is the director of the US and Americas program and the dean of the Queen Elizabeth II Academy for Leadership in International Affairs at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. She's also a reader, or for Americans, an associate professor in international relations at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Her book, Human Rights Futures, which was edited with Jack Snyder and Stephen Hopgood, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. She has also published numerous articles in leading journals of international affairs and is a regular contributor to the international news media. Leslie's a commissioner for the Marshall Aid Commemoration Commission, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, on the Board of Advisors of the Institute for Integrated Transitions, and on the advisory board of LSE Ideas. From 2015 to 2018, Leslie was a member of the council trustee of Chatham House. Leslie has a BA from Wesleyan University, an MSc with distinction from the London School of Economics, and a PhD from Columbia University. Go ahead, Professor Vinjamuri.
Okay, I'm thoroughly embarrassed now, but thank you very much. It's Leslie. I'm just going to be really quick because I want to make sure that we have 9 minutes for conversation or 10. And so let me just add a few interventions. First of all, I'm one of these people who spent much of my academic career thinking about intervention, human rights, transitional justice, and conflict. And then sort of, went a different direction when Donald Trump was elected, like I think of many people who suddenly became very concerned with democracy and human rights inside the United States. And also, related to that as an American and an academic living and working in the UK, about what that meant for America's symbolic power, about its foreign policy, and about many of the things that David Forsythe has outlined so well, and also Lynn and Andrea and Bruce, in terms of the issues that we've seen, both, in a more theoretical way, but also in terms of the current foreign policy. I just want to kind of jump on board, I guess, 3 or 4 issues that I see, or how I think about them. One is where we are. I think about 3 different maybe theoretical approaches that kind of pervade both the academic literature and the policy literature in terms of how human rights spreads or doesn't. There are others, but this is partly how I think about it. And let me say a word about where I think we are now. And those 3, like which one's sort of risen to the top in policy terms. And then I want to say something about Bruce's comments on sanctions and the hypocrisy question. So very quickly, I think about this as, there are 3 things that really inform a lot of the policy and academic literature on human rights diffusion, I guess. One is sequencing, right? And I think this has been, as we all know, a very big debate in the literature. And it's, by people like Larry Diamond and others, been thoroughly discredited. But I think that it still persists. And maybe one of the big questions that people still have in their mind in the policy field is, is China going to get out of the middle income track? Is it going to, people seem to have given up, but there's still this sort of question mark, right? Are the things that are stuck, or they're going backwards? Is it still fundamentally about sequencing? And until you get the institutions and democracy in place, you're not going to have human rights. It's not popular, right? But I think in the academic literature, it still informs a lot of what we do. The second is that, there are just tough trade-offs to make, right? You can't have it all. In an age where people are talking about geopolitical competition, you can either do your geopolitics, your deterrence, your sort of cooperation on climate and the big global public goods, or you can do your human rights naming and shaming. But, and I'm not saying that this is where Bruce sits, but if you do the latter, you might not get anywhere in any case, because it's going to misfire or backfire. And you also might set back your other agenda. I think that's not where the current public policy debate is at the moment, but I think that some of the practice operates in that space, and maybe a lot more than we like to think, certainly on questions of Turkey and India, those that we'd like to be in the fold. And maybe, there's a big question mark about China. And then the third place the third kind of way of thinking about this that I said as the separate tracks. And I think separate tracks is, ostensibly how the Biden administration characterizes human rights diplomacy, which is there is a track which is about human rights. And, it's not the same thing, we know, but it's also about democracy, and it's about values. And then there's a track that's about other things. And the separate tracks thing is just, to me, it's fascinating as a kind of, real world experiment. It's fascinating as a thought experiment. I think it's where a lot of US foreign policy was on the North Korea question for a period of time. There was one moment where I think people sort of went, forget it, we won't do separate tracks, we'll do everything. But there's a sort of logic in separate tracks that you can kind of de-link these issues, and then at some point maybe you face a trade-off, but let's just kind of keep going. I guess the question that that comes up in a lot of this, and especially when you start talking about separate tracks, is the question of hypocrisy. And hypocrisy, I think, has gotten a lot of attention, obviously, in the newspapers, but it's also gotten a lot of pretty rigorous scholarly attention, and people have different views of this. And I think implicit, and maybe Bruce is going to tell me I'm completely wrong, I think implicit in Bruce's analysis of sanctions is the idea that hypocrisy is actually a bad thing, or maybe that we shouldn't focus on hypocrisy. Because if you take, some of the arguments that are out there, hypocrisy is a good thing, even if you don't achieve what you're setting out to do when it comes to human rights. It's good that the language is out there. It's good that you're playing the long game. It gives hope and aspiration to civil society, both in your own country and in countries beyond your borders. That can, if you're Beth Simmons, lead to litigation in certain kinds of states, which leads to positive, progressive change. But if you're on the other side of it, hypocrisy is diminutive. It diminishes everybody. It makes it's sort of a joke of the United States. It gives space for bad actors to do bad things because America in particular is not doing what it says it would do. And it sort of, it has diminishing effects. I used to be a little bit on that side of thinking about the role of hypocrisy. And I had a kind of pivot moment when Peter Katzenstein came to SOAS and he gave a talk on his book on anti-Americanism, his edited book. And it was during, the global war on terror. And it was when everybody at SOAS was very aware of America's support of extraordinary rendition and torture on Black sites and all the rest of it. And somebody in the audience stood up and they said, and it was somebody who was very much on the critical theory, IR academic side of life. And they said, but we liked your hypocrisy, America. Could you please at least bring some of it back? Because this is awful. What you're doing is, and that was before Trump, right? So I think, I don't have a conclusion on it, but I think it's one of the most important questions out there, because inevitably, you don't talk the talk at every point. If you're doing separate tracks, there's going to be tons of hypocrisy. If you're doing trade-offs, there's going to be lots of hypocrisy. If you're doing sequencing, there's not so much hypocrisy, but nobody believes in sequencing anymore, at least not in the policy world. Final comment on sanctions. Bruce, I think your stuff on sanctions is so interesting, and you probably have already done this in your book, but if not, it speaks directly to a lot of the debates that were made about the use of international criminal justice and targeting individuals and backlash, and whether, that misfires or not, and whether you get anywhere in the end. And of course, the academics might have won some of those battles, but at a policy level, we completely lost that battle. But I think my comment on that is just, yes, I think you're right empirically, certainly on the use of international criminal justice as targeted sanctions through arrest warrants, especially if you don't have conditionality approached and incentives, and that, is the amnesty question. But are you right in the broader context? Like, at the end of the day, I've kind of been a little bit won over by the people who say, actually, it's good that we have the International Criminal Court. It's good that we have these things. A little bit of hypocrisy is not such a bad thing, actually. And even if, in the kind of narrow metric measure, it doesn't produce what you want it to produce. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. So we've got 8 minutes. We already have a question in the chat, in the Q&A, that's actually directed at Lynn. Lynn, can you see the question from Desiree Leclerc?
I do see the question. Let me read it.
So this is on the issue of child labor.
Right. Okay. And a little bit about domestic practice.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Right. Okay. So there's so much to respond to that the panelists said that also speaks to this particular question. And I would say this, when people talk about what the U.S. is doing domestically, when people talk about U.S. hypocrisy and they talk about U.S. leadership abroad, what they forget is U.S. transparency, which in comparison to a large number of other countries, including some of our allies, is pretty excessive in many ways. So if you want to know what the US is doing, you basically just have to read a paper and you'll find out. And then we will try to address, those issues, sometimes well, sometimes poorly, but we do try to address those issues, including in the multilateral fora. So where we screw up, does it prevent us from being able to lead in multilateral fora? I say no. I say we have to own up to where we've screwed up. We need to be transparent about that, transparent about trying to fix it. And then, sally forth, secure in the knowledge that a lot of countries are basically going to say, we're just not going to talk about that ever. So go away, international community. And hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. Bruce is asked to pick up on some of Leslie's points. You want to go ahead and do that, Bruce?
Sure. No, that's what I just want to respond to a couple of points, Leslie. The hypocrisy one, I don't totally disagree with you. Part of the reason I didn't use the MBS example and say, well, we didn't sanction like MBS, but we did it to our adversaries, was, sometimes actually I'm okay with that if you're using alternative means, so-called quiet diplomacy, right? So the fact that President Biden has not invited MBS and amidst this latest incredible David Ignatius story about Jordan is going to receive King Abdullah at the White House, that to me sends a real message to MBS, even though his assets didn't get hit. He's got plenty of assets anyway. So that's not what I'm trying to get at. What I'm trying to get at is the difference between, the impact, right? Not just that you say one thing and you do another, but if in fact you really do believe in, democracy promotion and human rights, and your actions are making them worse, that to me is not so much a question of hypocrisy that you don't always say the same thing or have the same values. It's a question of counterproductive policies, right? And I think that's different. And that's sort of my critique. I mean, it's not asking for purity, across who we sanction, but it's really getting at, if you put a value on human rights and democracy promotion, let's dig down a little deeper and see ways in which sanctions makes them worse, not just that we're saying, we're saying one thing, we're actually doing the same thing. So we're not being hypocritical by that, but the impact is really what I'm trying to get at, more than just we sanction some people we don't like, but, don't sanction those we like.
Thank you. So Corinne Lennox, who's one of our co-chairs, conference co-chairs, she posted two questions. The first one is, racial discrimination in the US has historically impacted on American credibility in promoting human rights and foreign policy. Has the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement influenced US foreign policy priorities in your view? And second, would any panelists like to reflect on the comments of Vice President Harris in Central America concerning migration?
I'll answer the first part of the question, which is yes. My colleagues, took note of the protests that I mean, Black Lives Matter protests were occurring in Holland and Australia and other places around the world, and that was noticed by the U.S. diplomatic community, and the need to address the issues a little bit more forthrightly, particularly when we're abroad. So yes, I would say it has affected U.S. foreign policy.
Thank you. Does anybody want to field the second question about the comments that VP Harris made in Central America about migration?
Can I add one thing to the first comment?
Sure.
I think it's a really interesting question, and it's clear, at least from the outside, and I can only speak very much from the outside, that Black Lives Matter has affected everybody, right, in the U.S. on every. It's regardless of where you sit on the question. But to me, it seems less clear so far how it's affecting U.S. foreign policy, and I think that for a lot of people, and I'm not saying this is not my view one way or the other. It's something actually I'm still thinking through, but I think for a lot of people sitting on this side of the pond, they felt like maybe Black Lives Matter hadn't affected the US enough on the recent violence in Israel and Palestine. And there was, as we know, there's a lot of conversation about that. What's the link? And it seemed to be affecting some domestically within the US, but it wasn't clear if that was showing up in foreign policy. And I think it was a very significant critique. I also found myself, this is very, kind of superficial sort of stuff, but it's meaningful, I think, symbolically. I found myself watching the Cornwall meetings and just thinking, on the one hand, it's wonderful, the West is getting back together and doing all these things. And on the other hand, I just thought it looks too perfect. Everybody's sort of a certain generation, and if we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter, a certain color, and it didn't really look like anything had changed. I couldn't see, I think at some level, since at some level, that's all it's really about is symbolism, really, at the end of the day, those meetings. It hasn't manifested itself in terms of the visuals yet. And I think that's something that will behoove us all to correct if we're going to speak to a more inclusive, larger audience.
Thanks. So we have like we're right at time, but we've got one last question that I want to put out there. This is again to Lynn, and this is from Leonard Castillo. I'm really glad, Leonard, you asked this question, because it would have been a question I would have asked. When you mention that the U.S. foreign policy is shaped by the Universal Declaration, when will the U.S. take action on the international arena on economic, social, and cultural rights, a true component of indivisible human rights, recognized in the UDHR and the Vienna Declaration? It would make a lot of sense coming from such a progressive administration like Biden with so much efforts on social issues here at home. Lynn, do you have anything to say about that?
Sure. I get a lot of questions about how the U.S. views economic, social, and cultural rights overall. And it's a view that actually has transcended several different administrations. So we don't deny that economic, social, and cultural rights exist. We see them as progressively realized rights. We see the linkage to anti-discrimination and the realization of those rights as being something that's critically important and something that this administration has said that it wants to deal with. I would encourage people who are saying, yeah, we're not seeing more out of this administration. It's nice to be normal, but we'd like to see more. This is still a very young administration. It's not even a year old. So a lot of the things that we're talking about with respect to race and foreign policy are things that are being discussed now. It's not something that we've done a lot in foreign policy, a focus on racial discrimination. We've focused on other kinds of discrimination, religious discrimination, for example. So it's early to say what this administration will, at the end of the day, do, because those plans are being done now. And again, the administration is less than a year old. We don't even have our Assistant Secretary for Human Rights yet. We don't have Azra Zaya, who will add some color to the lineup of foreign policy and is still waiting to be confirmed by the Senate. So
thank you.
Don't lose hope yet.
This is an ongoing, this is a question everybody gets asked. And so it's kind of interesting, it keeps coming up. So we're a little past time. So I'm going to wrap it up. I want to thank, first of all, our participants for joining us. Thank you for being here. And especially to all of our speakers for taking the time and not getting a trip to London. But taking the time out of your schedules to join us. Thank you so much, and thank you again to our hosts at the School of Advanced Study for setting up the session. I hope everybody has a nice morning, afternoon, or evening.